Hi, Jen and Dan. Welcome to the Lead Time Chats.
Hi, finally on.
Hi.
Yes, the podcast you all have helped sponsor and bring to life. Now your guests. So today we'll be talking about something that I think you two have heard a lot about, have been kind of on top of for the last year or so, which is kind of like setting intentional hybrid policies, coming back to the office. As both of you are, for new listeners, are the co-founders of Range, where I work. And so maybe to start us off, like, I guess I've been hearing a lot of different things. Like some people are happy to be in office like 2 days a week, even though they're commuting and driving like an hour away, because that's when they can focus and collaborate with their team. And some people are like, yeah, the moment my company asks me to bring me back in, like I'm gonna just look for another role, or like if my manager actually makes me come in, like I'm just gonna leave. So I guess maybe to start us off, like what are some of the stories you've heard? Like what are some of the experiences people are having as companies are bringing people back to the office?
I think it's very similar to what you just shared, right? We're hearing people who, and we hear both sides, right? We talk to people who are teammates as well as leaders, and we hear leaders who are like, the first chance I got, I took everyone remote. It just seems obviously better. Like I can hire across the country, I can, do all of these different advantages, versus ones who are like, I really am trying to get everyone back into the office. And I think, I've heard teammates who are like, I'm being told to come back in, but I moved. Like I no longer live in that area. And like, how do they handle that? And I know my perception is a lot of these things emerge because during the pandemic, so many companies have gone remote, but we didn't join those companies as prior to those policies existing. And so instead of being able to choose and opt in towards the companies that have the policies that fit our lifestyle, we're often kind of subject to the ones that are created ad hoc on the companies that we work with.
Yeah, I think it's just I think it's a very personal question, but then it's also contextual. So even if I like working in the office face to face, if I'm being forced to commute 45 minutes in traffic and then get to an office that's a ghost town, like I'm not going to want to go into the office. So we are hearing people struggling with that. So one person I talked to, they're meant to work at their desk 3 days a week in order to qualify for being a San Francisco employee. Otherwise, they get a 15% pay cut. But they go into their office and then Zoom. Well, actually, it's not in this case. It's not Zoom, but then virtual chat with people in the South Bay and New York, and they're not actually collaborating with people face to face anyway. So I think there's just like a lot of inconsistency to the policies. One company I thought was pretty good was like no remote people, 2 days in the office, and then they basically stack up meetings on the day. So very intentional. Like we're gonna be in the office on these 2 days of the week. We're gonna meet in person, do brainstorms, have collaboration, get all the benefits of in-person work, but then work remotely for the other 3 days. Versus another company which was, we'll support remote if you happen to be a certain distance from the office, but if you're within a certain distance of the office, then we expect you to come in 3 days a week because you're in the catchment area, which just felt a little bit inconsistent.
It seems like some of the more frustrating, from what I'm hearing, some of the more frustrating situations are when like it doesn't quite make sense, right? Like, why are you making me come to the office to then be on video call with people who aren't in the office? Or like, should I just move 2 miles to be out of the catchment area or whatever they call it, to like not have to be in 3 days a week? So like, as companies are creating their policies, like thinking through some of these edge cases.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest like arguments for bringing people back to the office is this serendipitous collaboration, and I think a lot of the data just shows that doesn't actually happen for the majority of people. I think when you move into open plan offices, face-to-face communication actually drops. I think 70% was one study, and then the sort of the serendipitous interactions in common rooms, the water cooler effect, doesn't really impact lots of people. So so potentially what we're really talking about is the serendipitous interactions that leaders get, but the majority of workers don't really benefit from those serendipitous interactions.
Yeah, I was curious because Jen, you were saying that like some managers are trying to get their, some managers are saying, oh, I just took my whole team remote, it just makes sense. And some managers are trying to get their whole team back in the office as soon as possible. Like, I guess, are there any patterns around, like, is it more executives are getting more benefit from that, like in-person serendipity, or like, and they tend to have the money to like live really close to, or the decision-making power to like decide where the the like office goes, or like what's the split you've seen, or is there any generalization?
I think some vague generalizations without hopefully stereotyping too much. Senior executives who also, just the way our society works, tend to be older, I think tend to have a viewpoint of being in office is better. And I don't necessarily begrudge them that opinion. It's based on, 10, 20, 30 years of experience, and based on how they have learned how to lead a company. And so I think part of what emerges for people in those positions is a little bit of fear, like how do I actually successfully lead a company if I'm not able to use all the tricks and tactics I've used over the last, X number of years of my career. And I think managers who are earlier or who have experienced remote and virtual communication in a different way just have a very different perception, where they're like, okay, it is different, but I am capable of doing that. And we as a company are capable of doing that. And so it tends to be like, honestly, like line managers get caught in the middle where they're like, my employees want to work from home, and like my senior leader is telling me I need to get them into the office. And I think it can feel really like troubling for them and disingenuous to like examples like Dan was sharing, where you come into the office and you're just on a video chat the whole time. It's like, okay, well, why am I here? I think just like any other company policy, like when it doesn't make sense, the entire company knows, like everyone feels that tension on a daily basis, and it is a tax and a cost. I think people often forget about that, of like, no, the benefit's going to be there, and don't realize how much they're kind of like paying an employee morale.
Mm-hmm. Dan, you had mentioned an example where you felt like a company was being very intentional about bringing people back. And we've been talking about like, executives and kind of individual contributors, line managers. Usually for companies of a certain size, people making the decisions are like people ops or, some operations team. For those people who are setting these policies, like what are some of the things, like what are the most important things that you think they should be considering as they start to roll out hybrid work policies?
Yeah, I mean, I think in this case, it came from the founders and CEO who are very opinionated about the kind of company they wanted to build and the kind of collaboration they thought was effective for the given stage of that company. So I think when the people ops or HR teams are enacting policies which are consistent with those beliefs and those values, then I think that can be powerful. I think where it gets tripped up is when they're trying to come up with hybrid policies, but then there's this unspoken belief system about what is good or accurate or correct, and then you end up with this like cognitive dissonance where people don't trust in others. So you might have this like hybrid policy where people are allowed to work remotely 2 or 3 days a week, but then you have people who believe people are slacking off those days and going to play tennis, or having like extra long lunches instead of being at their desk, and then that will kind of like erode some of the sort of the trust in the team. So I think it's about having consistency and then making sure that the reason that you want to have people in the office reflects in practice. So if you want people in the office for face-to-face collaboration, let's make sure you have face-to-face collaboration. Make sure you're scheduling time, making sure you're actually running effective in-person meetings, make sure that you're facilitating those serendipitous interactions that you believe are so powerful, versus making people sit quietly in a cube all day. Because I think then people just feel like they're being forced into the office just for surveillance, and it's not really about communication. It's about, you don't trust me to do my work.
Yeah, I think like the point around it coming from founders and CEOs, like I think that is like very common across most companies, that like the decision about whether to be hybrid and in what way is not really emerging from the people ops organizations. Like it's often a strongly held belief or a hunch by the leader, and then people ops is very much a partner in implementing the decision. But it feels like I've heard, particularly on views around wanting people in the office, it's often a strongly held view by the CEO. Like, and that you'll hear the team say that, like, well, this is our CEO, what they want, so like we can't do anything different. And that's like, I think, an interesting trend, because usually you don't hear that much about like another type of people ops policy or location thing, that it's like that closely held belief by the CEO.
Yeah.
I wonder if go ahead, Dan.
So I was gonna say, and then you end up with the tricky situation where they have those beliefs, but over the last 2 years they've hired say 50% of their team who are now remote. So what do you do? And I think the key piece of advice I would have for anyone is just to make sure it's consistent and makes sense. And if you have remote people and people who have to come into the office, how do you structure the organization to get the benefits of both of those? Like maybe you do what Stripe did and you have like the remote business unit and keep all those people working on similar projects. So then you're not diluting the in-person teams with remote people, or maybe you just say that yeah, you're going to fly people, you know, around a lot. But I think it's just when you end up with these inconsistent policies, I think that's where you get in trouble.
Yeah.
I'm curious, have you heard anything about like if the expectations for in-office work have changed? Because I feel like, Dan, when you were saying like, oh, maybe if people are remote, you think they're going to take an extra long lunch. Like people do that in office, right? They like take a long lunch and then they like go out and get coffee and like people do those things, and it was considered like normal office behavior. And I think now we're kind of in this state where like people have been working from home, and the kind of unspoken expectation is like you're just at your computer working for like 8 hours, and like you feel guilty if you like, you know, pop out for 20 minutes to get groceries or like lay down for a nap. But like people did all those things in the office. And so like, do you think those expectations are going to change so that people are kind of like, I don't know, paying more attention to it? Or yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I've heard varying different stories. I've heard people seeming more comfortable with rolling in at 11 o'clock after rush hour and then leaving at 3, and people trusting that it doesn't mean they're only working a 4-hour day, but they're actually just splitting, you know, half and half home and at work. I've also heard of people reverting to expecting people to be, you know, in the office before the CEO gets there, and then leaving after the CEO leaves, and going back to that old pattern. So I think there's a lot of like performance and presenteeism just in the sort of the. I mean, I think in some ways it's like generational trauma from like from, you know, just general, you know, work ethic, as it were.
Yeah, I think that comes up with remote work too, right? People are like, are they online, or like things coming up? I think we've talked, Jean, like that, like, yeah, there's in some ways like more guilt working from home if you like take time to eat lunch. Like I feel like I'll take like a half hour to like make food and eat lunch. I'm like, well, that was a long break. Like and it's like, yeah, in the office we'd take like an hour and a half, and it'd be like, well, I'm with coworkers, so I'm like doing bonding and creation of a company resource to some extent. Yeah, I'm curious over time, like there's pros and cons from an employment perspective or like a recruiting perspective on remote, because remote like allows you access to a lot more talent and things like that. But there's also this like budding thread of like, does being remote make you less tied to your team and therefore more easily willing to like leave and move to other jobs? And I think, you know, being founder of Range and thinking about remote software, that it's just something that you can intentionally invest in building remote culture and how you set that up. But I think companies that aren't doing that are seeing some tension there.
Yeah, I think it's because a lot of that culture building happened informally and unintentionally in the workplace. It was just a natural byproduct of being co-located. So when you're remote, it is very easy to get those things, and you have to be much more intentional.
Yeah.
Yeah, I imagine that, you know, companies may like a company may roll out the same policy, like roughly the same policy as another company, but if they're not kind of really intentional about their values, and like one company could get known for like, oh, the remote employees never get promoted, or like, whereas one company could really try to make it very equitable that like remote employees have the same access to information and opportunities. Like that could look, but on paper, like, you know, when you're applying for a job, it could look basically the same, right? Like 3 days in office, like whatever they advertise.
I think it was very similarly to the stories you hear in like the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, right? Where it's like, cool, everyone has the commitment on their website. Like we commit to equal hiring and promotion and things like that. And yet we also all know certain companies that are like, cool, I don't want to work there as a woman or as a person of color or different things, like because of the reputation. And I think that'll start to be true over time with remote work and inclusion of remote workers as well.
People will start to, have reputations that, you know, people just hear about from their friends. For like, so we've talked kind of about founders and like, but what about people who are kind of subject to the policies? Like if they are the ones who have moved during the pandemic and are now either considered remote and getting a pay cut, or maybe like didn't move and now have to be in the office 3 days a week when they've been working just fine. Like in those cases where they're kind of the policies that they have to adhere to don't quite make sense. Like, do you have any advice for how to help how these employees can kind of advocate for themselves? Like, I mean, there are some, I keep reading these things that are like, oh, just don't go. Like, organize and like, don't show up. And then they're going to have to change their policy. Like, is that, I don't know what you've been hearing, how people have been successfully able to like advocate for themselves.
I'm certainly pro employee organizing as a philosophy, but I do think like it can be very difficult in a one-on-one conversation, right? To be like, I don't understand why this policy is this way. And sometimes there are good reasons at a company level to make a policy that don't make sense for an individual, right? That like maybe someone is way ahead of the curve in terms of their ability to do remote work, but the other folks are like not as well capable, then that can be hard to like justify. I think like the types of things I would start to ask are focused around like, can we look at my work measured by outcomes, like versus like presence in the office? Like, what is driving this policy? Or like, is it, what are the underlying constraints that we're looking at? Because it's really hard to advocate for yourself or your teammates if you don't have information. And so kind of asking a little bit deeper questions of your manager or leaders and try to get them to like explain. Now that can be a difficult position depending on the size of your company. But I don't think it's a terrible idea to talk to teammates and understand what others want, because also they may not want the same things that you do, and that's helpful to understand.
Yeah, I think it is really tricky. I think understanding the goals and like why this policy is created is like the first step. But I think the problem is that in many cases that won't be transparently communicated.
Yeah.
I think in a lot of companies, like the real reason is that remote performance management is hard and they don't have any muscle or training on how to do that. And so they create basically lowest denominator policies to protect themselves in those situations and make it so that they can actively manage like underperformers. And unfortunately, that means that a lot of people who are high performers or very good at working remotely get caught up in those policies. So from my conversations, I think what ends up happening is then people have exceptions, and it's either the manager implicitly approves it or says like, I'm not going to worry about this, or the manager's manager approves it tacitly. But then you end up in this interesting situation where people aren't following the formal policy. And what happens then if a performance management issue does emerge? I think it's pretty complicated and tricky for individuals to advocate for themselves.
Yeah, I guess we're just starting to see the beginning of for companies that have a policy or kind of on that early stage, they're kind of just rolling it out. And so we may, I guess, if companies have like a hard date, there may be companies where like people, like it's clear that a large percentage of people just like are not coming in. So I guess we may then see like another wave of like policy iteration of like, well, clearly this isn't working.
And we have seen that over the last 2 years, haven't we? Like companies have said, we're going to have a back to work day, everyone is in the office, and they gradually like roll it back and become more flexible. So I think that will happen to some extent. Yeah.
Yeah, I think right now we're seeing kind of, at least from what I'm hearing, a lot of people are in the like exceptions, right? Like if you have, kids that are not like eligible for vaccination, or if you're, like X, Y, and Z, then you can like kind of push for an extension or, but I don't know how long. Maybe there's just going to always be like policy exceptions and then like implicit exceptions that everyone kind of, depending on their connections or their relationship with their manager, they'll be able to get one of those.
Yeah, and I think like it depends. I think in tech, there's still a lot of optionality in terms of what you choose for your work. Obviously, the economy is like shifting right now, and that is like changing to some extent. But I think that's one thing that the individual does have agency over at times is like, okay, do I want to stay here? And it can feel like, well, I want to be loyal to my team and to my manager and to these other things. But I'd encourage folks to also think about like, okay, well, I've brought up 8 times that I'd like to be able to work remote for these valid reasons, and I haven't gotten a good understanding. And as much as I care about my team, like the company is making these policies, et cetera. And there are lots of constraints like family and salary and all sorts of things that prevent people from moving jobs. But it is something that I think we will see over time of people leaving and going towards jobs. And that isn't necessarily bad, right? If a company wants everyone to be in the office and they're hiring exclusively for that, then they're going to attract the people that want that. And that is like, just like other company cultures, is a totally valid thing to hire or not hire for.
Yeah, I guess we'll maybe see a bit of like reshuffling, maybe not the great resignation again, but just kind of some like mild reshuffling as these policies get worked out and the reputations of companies get set. Like, yeah, people who want to be in office are going to gravitate towards the companies that, you know, the founders are really like enthusiastic about an in-office experience.
So it does seem that looking at some of the surveys, that only around 5% of people actually want to work in an office full time. Like half of people, it seems, want to work at home permanently, and then the 45% want to go back some days a week, but barely anyone wants to be in the office every single day. So however it shakes out, hybrid will be the new normal.
Yeah.
Maybe to tie up this conversation, whatever the reality is, I guess, of what you're hearing from companies, what would you love to see as like standard best practice for hybrid and remote work? I mean, that's a big question, but maybe just like 1 or 2 things.
I mean, something we've been talking about since pre-pandemic, and some of the early customer discovery we did for Range, was that if you make remote work better, you make work better for everyone. So just supporting remote work as a baseline for your team operations will make a more pleasant working experience for people who are even in the office full time or in an office hybrid. So I think being intentional about that, and being intentional about teamwork and communication and the cadence of communication, I think is what I hope to become more expected as a default operating policy.
Yeah, so not just defaulting back to like, oh, like that stuff will get just sorted out in office.
Yeah, exactly. I think to build on something Dan was sharing when we started this conversation is just, consistency and intentionality in the policies that people create. I don't think, we are obviously supportive of remote and hybrid work given kind of what we do at Range, but we don't necessarily see it as problematic to require people to come into the office certain days a week. It's more around if you are requiring people to come in and half the company's remote, so they're just on video calls, that's not very internally consistent. Whereas if you say we only hire people in these 2 cities and we ask that you come in these days a week, that is at least consistent. And I think that is kind of what we see companies who are thoughtful about culture moving towards, is consistency and having a principle behind an understanding of why their policies. And that's what I'd like to kind of see more and more companies come to, versus kind of somewhat ad hoc or trying to play both sides, when it just really the employees are the ones that suffer with that.
Yeah, that makes sense. The consistency and clarity also lets the employee choose, right? Like, oh, this is for me or this is not for me. And that doesn't mean it's a good or bad company. It's just different options, different preferences. Cool. All right. Thanks, you two. I'll talk to you later.
It was great chatting.